Hey guys, tonight we're digging into something a little different. Arguably more useful than my usual stuff if you ever find yourself without electricity, running water, or a clue how any of it actually works. Medieval survival techniques. But before we dive into this rabbit hole of forgotten wisdom, let me paint you a picture that should make you slightly uncomfortable. Right now, as you're watching this, your city probably has about 3 days' worth of food in the entire supply chain. 3 days. The average American home has maybe a week's worth of food. Optimistically, your water comes from treatment plants that require electricity to function. Your heat depends on natural gas pipelines or electrical grids that are frankly more fragile than we'd like to admit. I'm not trying to be alarmist here, but we've built our entire civilization on systems that would make a medieval peasant laugh. Not because they were tougher than us, though they probably were, but because they understood something we've forgotten. Resilience isn't about having the latest technology, it's about having knowledge that works when technology fails. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do me a favor, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, possibly while double-checking their canned goods, or wondering if their generator actually starts. All right, dim the lights, maybe get a fan going for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a world that runs on fragile power grids and just-in-time delivery, we've built a paradise on a foundation of glass. It's comfortable, sure. Convenient, absolutely. But it's brittle in ways that would terrify our ancestors. What happens when the lights go out, the trucks stop rolling, and the tap runs dry? What happens when the thin veneer of modern civilization gets peeled back and you're left with just your knowledge, your hands, and whatever's around you? The answer, I think, lies not in some high-tech bunker filled with gadgets, but in the accumulated wisdom of people who truly mastered the art of survival, the medieval peasant. Now, I know what you're thinking. Peasants? Really? Those poor, unwashed masses who died of tooth infections and thought the earth was flat? Here's the thing, that's mostly propaganda from people who wanted to feel superior to their ancestors. The medieval peasant was actually an incredibly sophisticated survival specialist. They had no gear, no gadgets, and zero guarantees of anything. But they had developed an ingenious set of skills for securing food, water, shelter, and safety that had been tested and refined over centuries. This wasn't just trial and error. This was a complete survival system that kept entire civilizations alive through plagues, famines, wars, and natural disasters that would bring our modern world to its knees. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a blueprint for resilience that works just as well today as it did 1,000 years ago. These people faced uncertainty as a daily reality and developed strategies for thriving despite it, not just surviving it. Their knowledge was their wealth, their skills were their security, and their community connections were their insurance policy. So tonight, we're cracking open the manual they never wrote down because they didn't need to. It was encoded in their daily lives, passed down through generations of people for whom failure meant death. We'll explore the core skills that made them masters of their environment, and more importantly, how you can adapt these techniques for the modern world. First up, let's look at how they solved the most critical problem, getting clean water when all you have is your own 2 hands and a hole in the ground. Mastering water without the grid. For us, water is an assumption as basic as gravity. Turn a handle, and there it is. Clean, pressurized, ready for whatever we need. We use it without thinking, waste it without caring, and assume it'll always be there. That convenience hangs by the thread of electric pumps, water treatment plants, and distribution systems that are far more vulnerable than most people realize. But here's what should keep you up at night. The average city water system has about 24-48 hours of backup power. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, millions of people lost water pressure within hours. When Texas froze in 2021, entire communities went days without running water. The infrastructure we depend on is a house of cards that can collapse faster than you can say boil water advisory. The medieval peasant faced this challenge every single day. For them, water wasn't an assumption. It was a daily quest that required knowledge, tools, and backup plans. Their solution wasn't to build more complex systems, it was to master simple, robust techniques that worked regardless of external conditions. Let me introduce you to one of humanity's most elegant engineering solutions, the sweep well, also known as a shade. This isn't some primitive contraption, it's a masterclass in applied physics that's been lifting water for over 4,000 years, and it's still in use today in parts of the world where people understand that simple often beats complex. Picture this. You've got a hand-dug well, maybe 20 feet deep, and you need to lift water out of it multiple times a day. Hauling a bucket of water straight up by rope is back-breaking work. A full bucket weighs about 40 pounds, and doing that dozens of times a day will destroy your back and exhaust your energy reserves. The medieval peasant couldn't afford that kind of inefficiency. Their innovation was beautiful in its simplicity, a long pole balanced on a fulcrum like a massive seesaw. On one end, your rope and bucket. On the other end, a heavy counterweight, a big rock, a log, whatever was handy but heavy. The physics are elegant. The counterweight does most of the heavy lifting for you. Here's how it works. You pull down on the rope to lower the bucket, which is easy because you're working against the counterweight. Once the bucket fills with water, now the heavy end of the system, you simply guide it upward. The counterweight, now relatively lighter, does the work for you, pulling the heavy bucket of water up as it descends. It's a system so efficient that a child could operate it, which was crucial when every hand in the community was needed for other survival tasks. But the genius goes deeper than just mechanical advantage. The sweep well was infinitely repairable. No complex gears to strip, no motors to burn out, no electrical components to fail. If the rope broke, you made a new one. If the counterweight shifted, you adjusted it. If the fulcrum wore out, you replaced it with local materials. It was technology that could be maintained indefinitely with basic tools and materials available anywhere. For anyone with an off-grid property, a well, or even urban dwellers thinking about backup water systems, this is one of the most robust solutions you can implement. Building a sweep well is a weekend project that gives you a completely manual backup to any electric pump system. When the power goes out, and it will, you're not dependent on generators, fuel, or repair services, but the principles extend beyond just well water. The same leverage concepts can be adapted for rainwater collection systems, grey water management, and even manual water pumping from streams or ponds. The key insight is using physics to amplify human effort rather than depending on external energy sources. The sweep well was just the mechanical solution. The medieval peasant also had to know where to dig, and this required reading the landscape like a book. They developed sophisticated techniques for locating groundwater that combined practical geology with careful observation of natural indicators. They knew that water follows gravity and collects in low places, but they also understood the subtleties. Certain plants, willows, cattails, elderberries, grew where water tables were high. Animal trails often led to water sources, and the behavior of livestock could indicate water nearby. They observed how morning dew collected differently in various locations, how fog patterns revealed underground streams, and how the color and texture of soil indicated moisture content. The practice of water witching or dowsing, using forked sticks to locate groundwater, sounds like medieval superstition, but there's actually some science behind it. Experienced practitioners were reading subtle environmental cues, changes in soil moisture, variations in plant growth, micro-topographical features that indicated underground water flow. Whether the stick actually detected water or the person was unconsciously processing environmental data, the success rate was often remarkably high. Medieval communities understood that water security was too important to leave to individual families. They developed sophisticated community water management systems that distributed both the labor and the benefits of water access. Village wells were often community projects, with each family contributing labor for digging and maintenance. Well schedules ensured that everyone had fair access while preventing overuse. Community water storage systems, large cisterns and holding tanks collected rainwater during abundant periods for use during dry spells. But the social engineering was as important as the physical infrastructure. Water rights were carefully managed through community agreements that had been tested over generations. During droughts, rationing systems ensured that critical needs were met first: livestock, cooking, basic hygiene, while non-essential uses were eliminated. While wells provided baseload water supply, medieval communities were masters of rainwater harvesting on a scale that puts most modern systems to shame. Every roof was a potential water collector. Every building was designed with water capture in mind. The basic principle is simple. A roof is just a big funnel. Gutters and downspouts directed rainwater into storage vessels, barrels, cisterns, even lined pits in the ground. But the sophistication was in the details. First flush diverters ensured that the initial rainwater, which washed dirt and debris off the roof, was diverted away from storage. Settling tanks allowed sediment to fall out before water entered final storage. Filtration systems using sand, charcoal, and cloth removed contaminants. The scale could be enormous. A modest 1,000 square foot roof can collect over 600 gallons of water from just 1 inch of rainfall. Medieval communities with proper rainwater systems could collect enough water to last through extended dry periods, providing genuine water security independent of wells or springs. Medieval people understood that not all water was safe to drink, even if it looked clean. They developed multiple techniques for purifying questionable water that work just as well today as they did centuries ago. Boiling was the most reliable method, but it required fuel that wasn't always available. Sand filtration was more economical. Layers of clean sand, gravel, and charcoal could remove many contaminants from murky water. Settling techniques used time and gravity to allow sediments and some bacteria to settle out of water that was then carefully decanted from the top. Solar disinfection was practiced long before anyone understood UV radiation. Clear water in transparent containers left in direct sunlight for several hours would be significantly safer to drink. The UV light from the sun killed many waterborne pathogens, while the heat enhanced the disinfection process. Clay pot filtration used unglazed ceramic vessels to filter water. The tiny pores in the clay removed bacteria and other contaminants, while allowing clean water to seep through. These clay filters could be made locally and lasted for years with proper care. Perhaps most importantly, medieval communities developed what we might call a water mindset, an understanding that water was precious and needed to be used efficiently. They practiced grey water recycling centuries before it became an environmental buzzword. Water used for washing was saved for irrigating gardens. Cooking water was reused for cleaning. Even wastewater had uses for composting, construction, or feeding animals. This mindset created habits of conservation that maximized the utility of every drop. They bathed less frequently but more efficiently. They cooked in ways that minimized water use. They cleaned clothes and dishes using techniques that required less water while achieving the same results. For modern people, adopting this mindset means understanding water as a finite resource that requires active management rather than passive consumption. It means having backup systems, understanding conservation techniques, and recognizing that water security is personal responsibility, not just municipal infrastructure. Taming the flame. Fire is civilization in a spark. It's the difference between surviving and thriving, between eating raw scraps and enjoying cooked meals, between huddling in the cold and creating warmth that can sustain life through the harshest conditions. Today, we carry 1,000 potential fires in a pocket lighter, flip a switch for instant heat, turn a knob for cooking flames, but lighters run out, gas lines fail, power grids collapse. In a real survival scenario, convenience is no match for a truly sustainable fire system. The medieval peasant understood something we've largely forgotten: making fire is just the beginning. The real mastery lies in keeping it, transporting it, controlling it, and using it efficiently. They developed fire management techniques that were so sophisticated they bordered on scientific, creating systems that could maintain fire for months or even years without interruption. Modern fire-starting methods are marvels of chemistry and engineering, but they're all fundamentally fragile. They depend on manufactured materials, chemical compounds, and precision engineering that can't be replicated in the field. When your Bic lighter runs out of butane, or your ferro rod wears down to nothing, you're back to hoping someone else has fire. The medieval approach was different. Their primary fire-starting method, flint and steel, used materials that were available almost anywhere and created tools that could last for generations. High-carbon steel struck against flint creates a shower of hot sparks through simple physics. The steel fragments, heated by the impact, oxidize rapidly in the air, creating tiny burning particles hot enough to ignite tinder. But here's where it gets interesting. Those sparks are fleeting, lasting only milliseconds and too small to directly ignite anything substantial. They needed an intermediary, something that could catch those ephemeral sparks and transform them into something more useful, a sustained ember. This is where the real science came in. Medieval firemakers discovered that certain materials could be processed to have incredibly low ignition temperatures while burning slowly and steadily once lit. Charcloth was the most common natural fabric, like linen or cotton, that had been cooked in an oxygen-free environment until it carbonized. The process required placing cloth in a sealed metal container with just a pinhole for pressure release, then heating it until no more smoke emerged from the hole. The resulting charcloth was black, lightweight, and brittle, but it had an almost magical property. A single spark would catch it and begin to glow, not with a flame, but with a persistent red ember that could last for several minutes. This ember was the seed from which all fire grew. Creating fire from an ember required understanding the 3 stages of combustion, something medieval firemakers learned through necessity and perfected through practice. The ember was stage 1, glowing carbon that provided heat but no flame. Stage 2 was creating actual fire by providing the ember with progressively larger amounts of combustible material. Stage 3 was building that initial flame into a sustainable fire that could burn independently. The tinder bundle was their solution for bridging stages 1 and 2. This wasn't just a random pile of dry material. It was a carefully constructed nest of the finest, driest, most combustible materials available. The outer layer might be shredded bark from birch or cedar, processed until it was almost like cotton. The inner core would be even finer material, cattail fluff, thistle down, or finely shredded dry grass. The technique required precise placement and timing. The glowing charcloth was carefully placed in the center of the tinder bundle, which was then gently folded around it. The key was providing just enough airflow to feed the ember oxygen while containing the heat to build temperature. Gentle, steady breathing into the bundle fed the ember until the surrounding tinder reached ignition temperature and burst into flame. This moment, the transition from ember to flame, was critical. Too much air too fast, and you'd blow out the ember. Too little, and it would die from oxygen starvation. Too much tinder, and the heat would dissipate. Too little, and there wouldn't be enough fuel to sustain combustion. It was a skill that required practice and understanding, but once mastered, it provided fire-making capability that was virtually weatherproof and completely sustainable. Here's where medieval fire mastery really shines, with a concept that's almost completely lost today. They didn't just make fire, they transported it. They understood that the hardest part was getting that first flame. So once they had it, they made sure never to lose it. The technique used specially prepared materials that could sustain combustion for extended periods with minimal oxygen. Tinder fungus, particularly amadou or false tinder fungus, was processed by boiling, drying, and sometimes treating with saltpeter to create a material that would smolder for hours or even days when properly contained. A glowing ember from the home fire was placed in a piece of prepared fungus, which was then sealed in a container, a hollowed-out horn, a leather pouch, or a specially made tinderbox. With limited oxygen, the fungus wouldn't burst into flame, but it would maintain a slow, steady smolder that could be transported over long distances and extended periods. When fire was needed in the field, the process was simple. Open the container, place the smoldering fungus in a fresh tinder bundle, and blow it back to life. No flint and steel required, no risk of failure in wet weather, no complex preparation. It was the medieval equivalent of a pilot light, a constant, reliable source of fire that could be activated instantly. Some communities maintained communal fires that burned continuously for decades, with designated firekeepers responsible for ensuring the flames never died. These eternal fires served as backup systems for individual families and sources of fire for new households. During times of war or crisis, special fire carriers would transport embers to new locations, ensuring that fire knowledge and capability spread with the community. Medieval communities used fire for far more than just warmth and cooking. They developed sophisticated applications that transformed fire from a simple tool into a complete technology platform that supported their entire way of life. Pottery firing required understanding temperature control and atmospheric conditions that would impress modern ceramicists. Clay vessels were essential for food storage, water transport, and cooking, but creating durable pottery required achieving specific temperatures while controlling oxidation and reduction cycles. Medieval potters built kilns that could reach and maintain temperatures over 1000 degrees Celsius using nothing but wood fuel and careful airflow management. Metalworking with fire enabled the creation and repair of essential tools. Blacksmithing wasn't just about making horseshoes, it was about creating and maintaining the metal tools that made survival possible. Understanding how to achieve forging temperatures, how to control carbon content in steel, and how to heat treat metals for different applications required sophisticated fire management skills. Charcoal production was a specialized fire application that created high-energy fuel from abundant wood resources. The process required building carefully controlled fires that burned wood in oxygen-limited environments, driving off volatile compounds while leaving pure carbon. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than wood, making it essential for metalworking and other high-temperature applications. Lime production for construction and agriculture required building extremely hot fires to decompose limestone into quicklime. This quicklime was then used for making mortar, plaster, and soil amendments. The fires had to reach temperatures over 900 degrees Celsius and be maintained for extended periods, requiring sophisticated fuel management and airflow control. Medieval communities developed comprehensive fire safety and management systems because uncontrolled fire was one of the greatest threats they faced. Entire villages could be destroyed in minutes if fire escaped control, so they created both prevention and response systems that were remarkably effective. Fire breaks were built into village layouts, open spaces, water sources, and stone structures that could stop fire from spreading. Buildings were often spaced to prevent fire from jumping between structures, and community water sources were positioned for quick access during emergencies. Fire suppression techniques used available materials and community coordination to fight fires effectively. Sand, dirt, and water were the primary suppression agents, but medieval communities also understood the value of creating fire breaks by removing combustible materials from the fire's path. Community fire response was organized like early fire departments, with designated roles and responsibilities for different community members during fire emergencies. Some people were responsible for water supply, others for evacuation, still others for fire suppression. These systems were practiced and refined over generations, creating response capabilities that could save lives and property during fire emergencies. The medieval approach to fire teaches several crucial lessons for modern preparedness. First, true fire independence requires understanding multiple fire-starting methods and having redundant systems. Second, fire management, keeping, controlling, and using fire efficiently, is as important as fire starting. Third, fire is a tool that can enable many other survival capabilities beyond just warmth and cooking. Modern practitioners can adapt these techniques using contemporary materials while maintaining the principles. Char cloth can be made using modern containers and heat sources. Tinder bundles can incorporate modern synthetic materials that burn reliably. Fire transportation can use modern containers and insulation while following medieval principles. The goal isn't to recreate medieval life, but to understand fire as a complete system rather than just a convenient tool. When you can start fire reliably in any weather, transport it efficiently, and use it for multiple applications, you've achieved a level of independence that no amount of modern gear can match. The Living Pantry. The modern grocery store is a miracle of global logistics, a cornucopia of foods from around the world, available year-round regardless of season or local conditions. Walk into any supermarket and you'll find strawberries in December, tropical fruits in temperate climates, and processed foods that can last for years without spoiling. It's also an illusion that has disconnected us from our food sources so completely that most people couldn't identify edible plants growing in their own backyards. If those shelves went empty tomorrow, and they could faster than you might think, most of us would be lost, standing in the middle of landscapes filled with edible plants we don't recognize, surrounded by a natural world we can no longer read. The just-in-time delivery system that stocks our supermarkets typically operates with 24/72 hours of inventory. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, grocery stores were empty within hours. When COVID disrupted supply chains, panic buying cleared shelves in days. The medieval peasant lived inside their pantry. The fields, forests, hedgerows, and even their own yards were a living larder that provided food year-round, but only if you had the knowledge to access it. Their foraging wasn't some casual weekend walk looking for interesting plants. It was a systematic, scientific approach to wild food procurement that represented their ultimate insurance policy against famine, crop failure, and economic collapse. Modern foraging education often focuses on exotic or gourmet wild foods, fiddlehead ferns, wild mushrooms, unusual berries. That's fine for supplementing a regular diet, but it misses the point of survival foraging. Medieval peasants focused on plants that were abundant, easily identified, calorie-dense, and available for extended periods. They didn't need to be master botanists. They needed to be experts on what worked. Take the humble stinging nettle. To modern suburbanites, it's a weed to be eliminated, something that causes painful stings when you accidentally brush against it. To the medieval peasant, it was a nutritional powerhouse available from early spring through late fall. Young nettle leaves are rich in protein, iron, vitamins A and C, and numerous other nutrients. Once cooked, and cooking eliminates the sting completely, they taste similar to spinach and can be used in soups, stews, or eaten as a vegetable side dish. But the nettle's value went beyond just nutrition. The fibrous stems could be processed into thread and rope. The leaves could be dried and stored for winter use. Even the roots had medicinal applications. A single plant provided food, medicine, and materials. This kind of multi-use efficiency was characteristic of medieval plant knowledge. Dandelions represent another perfect example of peasant plant wisdom. Modern lawn care spends billions of dollars annually trying to eliminate what is actually one of our most nutritious and useful wild plants. Every part of the dandelion is edible and beneficial. Young leaves make excellent salad greens or cooked vegetables. The flowers can be eaten raw, made into wine, or battered and fried. The roots can be roasted and ground as a coffee substitute, eaten as root vegetables, or processed for medicinal uses. The key insight is seasonal timing. Medieval foragers knew exactly when each plant was at its optimal state. Dandelion leaves are best in early spring before the flowers appear. After flowering, they become bitter and tough. Nettle is best harvested when young and tender. Acorns need to be collected in fall when they're fresh, not after they've been on the ground for weeks. Raw wild plants often require processing to be safe, palatable, or digestible. Medieval people developed sophisticated techniques for transforming plants that were toxic, bitter, or indigestible in their raw state into safe, nutritious foods. Acorn processing represents one of the most advanced wild food technologies. Acorns are incredibly abundant in oak forests and are packed with carbohydrates and fats, but they contain tannins that make them bitter and potentially harmful if eaten in large quantities. Medieval communities developed leaching processes that removed these tannins while preserving the nutritional content. The process involved shelling the acorns, grinding them into meal, and then repeatedly rinsing the meal with water until the bitter tannins were washed away. The water would be changed multiple times over several days until it ran clear and tasted neutral. Different oak species required different processing times. White oak acorns had fewer tannins and required less processing, while red oak acorns were more bitter but often more abundant. The resulting acorn flour was highly nutritious and could be stored for months. It could be used to make bread, thicken stews, or eaten as porridge. Some communities developed large-scale acorn processing operations that could produce enough flour to sustain entire villages through difficult periods. Cattle processing utilized nearly every part of the plant. The young shoots could be eaten raw or cooked like asparagus. The flower spikes could be boiled and eaten like corn on the cob. The pollen could be collected and used as a protein-rich flour additive. The roots could be processed to extract starch, creating a flour-like substance that was highly nutritious and storable. Root processing was particularly important because roots were often available when above-ground plant parts weren't. Many edible roots, wild onions, Jerusalem artichokes, groundnuts, required specific preparation techniques to maximize their nutritional value and remove potential harmful compounds. Medieval foragers thought in terms of seasonal calendars that tracked when different wild foods would be available and at their optimal state. This wasn't casual knowledge. It was precise timing that could mean the difference between nutrition and starvation. Spring foraging focused on young greens and shoots that provided essential vitamins after a winter of preserved foods. Wild garlic, ramps, young dandelion leaves, nettle shoots, and early berries provided fresh nutrition that helped prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Spring was also the time for collecting sap from maple trees, which could be boiled down into syrup or sugar. Summer foraging emphasized fruits, berries, and seeds that could be eaten fresh or preserved for later use. Wild strawberries, blackberries, elderberries, and numerous other fruits provided vitamins and natural sugars. Seeds from various grasses and wild plants could be collected and processed into flour or eaten directly. Fall foraging concentrated on nuts, roots, and late fruits that would provide calories through the winter. Acorns, walnuts, hazelnuts, and other nuts were collected in large quantities and processed for storage. Root vegetables were dug and stored using various preservation techniques. Late apples and other fruits were collected for immediate use or preservation. Winter foraging was limited, but not impossible. Certain plants remained available: rose hips for vitamin C, pine needles for tea, inner bark from trees for emergency food. Stored wild foods from earlier seasons provided nutrition when fresh options were scarce. Medieval people didn't draw sharp distinctions between food and medicine. Many plants served both purposes, and maintaining health was understood to depend on proper nutrition from diverse plant sources. Elderberry was prized both as food and medicine. The berries were eaten fresh, made into wine, or preserved for winter use. But elderberry was also recognized as having immune-supporting properties that were particularly valuable during cold and flu season. Modern science has validated many of these traditional uses, confirming that elderberries contain compounds that can help fight viral infections. Wild garlic and onions provided both flavoring and antimicrobial benefits. These plants were used to season foods, while also providing natural antibiotic properties that help prevent food poisoning and other infections. They were often collected in large quantities and preserved for use throughout the year. Plantain, often called white man's footprint, was recognized as a powerful wound-healing plant. The leaves could be chewed and applied to cuts, stings, and other minor injuries to promote healing and prevent infection. It was also edible, providing additional nutrition while serving its medicinal functions. Willow bark was known to relieve pain and reduce fever. It contains salicin, which is chemically related to aspirin. Medieval people didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the effects and used willow bark tea to treat various ailments. Wild food knowledge was too important to be left to individual learning. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting this crucial survival information across generations. Specialized knowledge keepers, often older women, maintained detailed understanding of plant identification, processing techniques, and seasonal timing. This knowledge was passed down through hands-on teaching that began in childhood and continued throughout life. Children learned by accompanying adults on foraging expeditions, participating in processing activities, and gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. Community foraging expeditions ensured that knowledge was shared widely and that optimal foraging locations were known to multiple people. These expeditions also provided safety. Experienced foragers could prevent dangerous mistakes and ensure that foraging was done sustainably without depleting local plant populations. Seasonal gathering festivals combined foraging with community celebration, creating positive associations with wild food procurement, while ensuring that critical seasonal timing was observed by the entire community. These festivals also provided opportunities for knowledge testing and transfer as different community members shared their expertise. Modern foraging requires adapting medieval knowledge to contemporary conditions while addressing new challenges like pollution, property rights, and changed ecosystems. Urban foraging focuses on plants that thrive in developed environments while avoiding areas that may be contaminated with pollutants. Many wild edibles, dandelions, plantain, clover, purslane, are common in urban areas and can provide significant nutritional benefits when properly identified and safely harvested. Suburban foraging takes advantage of landscaping plants and manage green spaces while respecting property rights and local regulations. Many common landscaping plants are edible: rose hips, elderberries, wild strawberries, and can be harvested with permission from property owners. Safety considerations for modern foraging include understanding pollution sources, avoiding areas treated with chemicals, and being absolutely certain of plant identification. Modern field guides, plant identification apps, and local foraging groups can provide education and support for people learning wild food procurement. Legal and ethical foraging requires understanding local laws, property rights, and sustainable harvesting practices. Many areas have regulations about wild plant collection, and ethical foraging means taking only what you need while ensuring that plant populations remain healthy for future harvesting. Perhaps the most important lesson from medieval foraging is developing what we might call a foraging mindset, the ability to see potential food sources in natural landscapes that most people walk past without noticing. This mindset requires shifting from thinking about food as something that comes from stores to understanding food as something that grows naturally in the environment around us. It means learning to recognize edible plants in their natural settings, understanding seasonal cycles and optimal harvesting times, and developing the processing skills necessary to make wild plants safe and palatable. The foraging mindset also includes understanding ecological relationships, how plants interact with their environment, how human activity affects plant populations, and how to harvest sustainably without damaging natural systems. For modern people, developing this mindset provides multiple benefits beyond just emergency food procurement. It creates deeper connections with natural environments, provides opportunities for outdoor exercise and education, and offers insurance against food supply disruptions. Most importantly, it reconnects us with the fundamental human skill of procuring nutrition directly from the natural world, a capability that sustained our species for thousands of years and could do so again if necessary. The original refrigerator. Our relationship with food preservation is fundamentally broken. We've become so dependent on refrigeration that most people can't imagine keeping food safe without an electric refrigerator humming away 24/7 in the kitchen. That dependence is absolute. When the power goes out, we have maybe 24-48 hours before everything in the fridge starts spoiling, and most of us have no backup plan beyond hoping the electricity comes back on. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern refrigeration is barely 100 years old. For thousands of years before that, humans not only preserved food successfully, but often created preserved foods that were more nutritious, more flavorful, and longer lasting than anything we can achieve with electric refrigeration. The medieval peasant didn't have a backup plan for when the refrigerator failed. They were the backup plan. Their food preservation systems were so sophisticated and reliable that many communities could store enough food to last through multi-year famines. They understood food chemistry in ways that would impress modern food scientists, and they created preservation methods that were simultaneously more sustainable and more resilient than anything we use today. The foundation of medieval food preservation was understanding the earth itself as a massive, reliable refrigeration system. Soil is an incredible insulator, maintaining stable temperatures regardless of surface weather conditions. Once you get below the frost line, typically 4 to 6 feet deep in most climates, temperatures remain remarkably constant year-round, usually between 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 13 degrees Celsius. This isn't quite as cold as a modern refrigerator, but it's perfect for long-term storage of most foods. And it comes with several advantages that electric refrigeration can't match. It's completely free. It works indefinitely without maintenance. It's not dependent on any external energy source, and it actually gets more effective over time as the thermal mass stabilizes. The root cellar was their primary earth-based storage technology, but calling it just a hole in the ground massively understates the engineering sophistication involved. A proper root cellar was a precisely engineered environmental control system that managed temperature, humidity, air circulation, and pest control to create optimal storage conditions for different types of food. Construction began with site selection based on drainage, soil type, and accessibility. The best root cellars were built into hillsides when possible, taking advantage of natural earth insulation on 3 sides while providing easy access from the 4th. The depth was critical. Too shallow and temperatures would fluctuate with the seasons. Too deep and you'd hit groundwater. The sweet spot was usually 6 meters 8 feet deep, just below the frost line. The internal design was where the real expertise showed. Stone walls weren't just for structure, they provided thermal mass that helped maintain stable temperatures and absorbed excess moisture during humid periods while releasing it during dry spells. The stones were often laid without mortar, allowing the structure to breathe and naturally regulate humidity levels. Ventilation was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect. A properly designed root cellar had 2 ventilation shafts, a cold air intake near the floor, and a warm air exhaust near the ceiling. This created a gentle circulation system that prevented stagnation and mold while maintaining the humid conditions that kept vegetables from drying out. The intake was often protected with screens or gratings to keep out rodents while allowing airflow. Different areas within the cellar were optimized for different types of storage. Root vegetables like carrots, beets, and turnips were stored in bins filled with slightly damp sand or sawdust. Potatoes needed ventilation and darkness to prevent sprouting and greening. Apples required specific humidity levels and needed to be stored separately from other foods because they produce ethylene gas that can cause other produce to spoil faster. Salt preservation was the medieval peasants' most powerful food preservation technology, but their understanding of salt chemistry was far more sophisticated than just salt prevents spoilage. They knew that different types of salt had different properties, that salt concentration needed to be precisely controlled for different foods, and that salt preservation could be combined with other techniques to create foods that were not only preserved, but actually improved by the process. Rock salt, mined from ancient seabeds, was pure and consistent but expensive. Sea salt, evaporated from ocean water, contained trace minerals that added flavor and preservation power but required more processing to remove impurities. Bay salt, harvested from coastal salt marshes, had distinctive flavors that were prized for certain applications. The science of salt curing depended on understanding osmosis and water activity. Salt draws moisture out of food through osmotic pressure, creating an environment where bacteria and mold can't survive. But the process had to be controlled carefully. Too little salt, and spoilage bacteria could still thrive. Too much salt, and the food became inedibly salty, and the valuable salt was wasted. Dry salt curing was used for meats, but would be consumed within a few months. The meat was rubbed with coarse salt and packed in barrels with additional salt layers. The salt drew out moisture over several weeks, creating bacon, salt pork, or salt beef that could last through the winter. The amount of salt was carefully calculated based on the weight of meat, the expected storage time, and the temperature conditions. Brine curing created longer-lasting preservation for larger cuts of meat. A supersaturated salt solution, strong enough to float an egg, was used to cure hams, large roasts, and whole fish. The meat was submerged in brine for weeks or months, allowing the salt solution to penetrate completely. Herbs and spices were often added to the brine, both for flavor and for their antimicrobial properties. Smoking meat wasn't just about adding flavor. It was sophisticated food chemistry that combined preservation, pest control, and flavor enhancement into a single process. Medieval smokehouses were precision instruments designed to control temperature, airflow, and smoke density to achieve specific preservation goals. The chemistry of smoking involves several preservation mechanisms. Working simultaneously, smoke contains formaldehyde and other antimicrobial compounds that kill bacteria and inhibit spoilage. The drying effect of warm, moving air removes moisture that bacteria need to survive. The formation of a protective surface layer seals the meat and prevents contamination. Certain wood types contain additional preservative compounds. Juniper has antimicrobial oils. Oak contains tannins that inhibit bacterial growth. Cold smoking was the primary preservation method, done at temperatures below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, to preserve rather than cook the meat. This required carefully controlled fires using specific wood types and damping techniques to create dense smoke without excessive heat. The process could take weeks or even months for large pieces of meat, but the results were incredibly long-lasting. Properly cold-smoked meats could last for years without refrigeration. Hot smoking combined cooking with preservation, done at temperatures between 225 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 107 to 121 degrees Celsius. This created ready-to-eat foods that lasted for weeks or months, perfect for immediate consumption or shorter-term storage. The higher temperatures cooked the meat while the smoke provided preservation and flavor. Wood selection was crucial for achieving desired flavors and preservation qualities. Oak burned clean and steady with mild flavor, perfect for long smoking processes. Apple and cherry woods provided fruity flavors and good preservation. Hickory gave intense flavor and excellent preservation, but required careful control to avoid overpowering delicate meats. Juniper was prized for its antimicrobial properties and distinctive flavor. Medieval fermentation was sophisticated biotechnology that harnessed beneficial microorganisms to preserve food while often making it more nutritious and digestible than the original ingredients. This wasn't accidental fermentation, it was carefully controlled biological processes that had been refined over centuries. Sauerkraut production demonstrates the sophistication of medieval fermentation science. The process begins with precise salt ratios, typically 2 to 3% salt by weight of cabbage, that create conditions favorable to beneficial lactobacillus bacteria while suppressing harmful microorganisms. The cabbage is shredded, salted, and packed tightly in containers to create anaerobic conditions. The fermentation proceeds in predictable stages. Initial fermentation converts cabbage sugars into lactic acid, creating the characteristic sour flavor while lowering pH to levels that prevent spoilage. Secondary fermentation develops complex flavors and continues acidification. Proper fermentation creates sauerkraut that can last for months or even years, while providing probiotics and vitamin C that were essential for preventing scurvy during long winters. Cheese-making represented the pinnacle of medieval fermentation technology. Different types of milk, different bacterial cultures, different aging conditions, and different processing techniques created hundreds of distinct cheese varieties, each optimized for specific storage conditions and nutritional needs. The process began with milk quality. Medieval cheesemakers understood that milk from different seasons, different animals, and different diets produced different cheeses. Bacterial cultures were maintained as heirloom strains passed down through generations, creating regional cheese varieties with distinctive characteristics. Aging environments were carefully controlled to create optimal conditions for different cheese types. Natural caves provided ideal temperature and humidity conditions, but medieval communities also built artificial aging chambers when natural caves weren't available. Different cheeses required different aging conditions. Some needed high humidity, others required air circulation. Some developed beneficial mold cultures that were carefully maintained. Individual families could manage their own preservation needs, but medieval communities understood that food security was too important to leave entirely to individual efforts. They developed sophisticated community storage systems that pooled resources, shared expertise, and provided backup for individual families whose preservation efforts failed. Community granaries were the foundation of village food security. These large storage buildings were designed to keep grain dry, pest-free, and accessible for distribution during emergencies. Construction used techniques specifically designed for grain storage: raised floors to prevent moisture and rodents, carefully designed ventilation to prevent mold, and secure access to prevent theft. Grain storage technology was remarkably sophisticated. Different grains required different storage conditions based on their moisture content, oil content, and susceptibility to pests. Wheat could be stored for years if properly dried and protected. Barley required more careful moisture control. Oats needed ventilation to prevent spoilage. Each grain type was stored separately using techniques optimized for its specific characteristics. Pest control used both physical and biological methods. Storage containers were designed to exclude rodents and insects. Natural pest deterrents, aromatic herbs, diatomaceous earth, wood ash, were mixed with stored grains to kill or repel pests. Some communities maintained populations of cats or other predators to control rodent populations around storage areas. Community preservation facilities shared expensive equipment and specialized knowledge that individual families couldn't maintain alone. Large-scale smoking operations could process meat from multiple families efficiently. Community wine and beer production used specialized equipment and expertise to create alcoholic beverages that provided both nutrition and preservation of agricultural surpluses. Medieval food preservation was organized around seasonal cycles that determined when different preservation activities could be done most effectively. Understanding these natural rhythms was essential for successful food preservation. Attempt preservation at the wrong time, and entire food supplies could be lost to spoilage. Autumn was the primary preservation season, when most animals were slaughtered and most preservation work was done. Animals were at their fattest after summer feeding. Weather was cool enough to prevent spoilage during processing, and there was enough time before winter to complete preservation processes. Community preservation activities were carefully coordinated to make efficient use of labor and equipment. The timing of animal slaughter was precisely calculated based on feed availability, weather conditions, and preservation capacity. Animals had to be fat enough to provide adequate meat and fat for preservation, but slaughter couldn't wait too long, or winter feeding costs would become prohibitive. Different animals were slaughtered at different times based on their optimal condition and preservation requirements. Weather prediction was crucial for timing preservation activities. Meat preservation required cool, dry weather to prevent spoilage during processing. Grain harvest and storage required dry conditions to prevent mold. Fermentation activities needed specific temperature ranges to work properly. Medieval communities developed sophisticated weather prediction abilities based on natural indicators and seasonal patterns. Medieval preservation techniques can be adapted for modern use, providing backup systems that work when modern infrastructure fails, while often producing superior results to industrial preservation methods. Root cellars can be built using modern materials and techniques, while following medieval design principles. Modern insulation, ventilation systems, and construction materials can improve performance while maintaining the basic earth-sheltered design that makes root cellars work. Even urban dwellers can create mini root cellars using basements, crawl spaces, or buried containers. Salt preservation can be done safely using modern understanding of food safety while following traditional techniques. Modern salt is purer and more consistent than medieval salt, making it easier to achieve precise preservation results. Understanding proper salt ratios, curing times, and storage conditions allows modern practitioners to create preserved meats that rival commercial products. Smoking can be done using modern equipment while following traditional principles. Modern smokers provide better temperature and airflow control than medieval smokehouses, making it easier to achieve consistent results. Understanding wood selection, temperature control, and timing allows modern practitioners to create smoked foods that last for months without refrigeration. Fermentation has experienced a renaissance as people rediscover the health benefits and superior flavors of traditionally fermented foods. Modern fermentation can use traditional techniques with modern understanding of food safety and microbiology to create fermented foods that are both safe and superior to commercial products. The key insight from medieval preservation is that food preservation should be a system, not just individual techniques. The most resilient approach combines multiple preservation methods, maintains backup systems, and understands seasonal timing and natural cycles. When you can preserve food using earth storage, salt curing, smoking, and fermentation, you have a food security system that can function independently of any external infrastructure and often produces better results than modern industrial methods. The thermal wall. In our modern world, shelter is something we buy, not something we build. We purchase homes, rent apartments, or at best hire contractors to construct buildings using industrial materials and complex systems that most of us don't understand. When those systems fail, when the heating goes out, when the roof leaks, when structural problems develop, we call professionals and hope they can fix problems we're not equipped to handle ourselves. This dependence on complex purchased shelter creates enormous vulnerability. When Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, when wildfires swept through California, when tornadoes flattened entire towns, people were left not just homeless but helpless, unable to create even basic shelter without massive outside assistance. The infrastructure that supports modern shelter, electrical grids, supply chains, skilled trades, can disappear overnight, leaving people completely dependent on emergency services that may not be available. The medieval peasant approached shelter entirely differently. For them, shelter wasn't a product to be purchased, but a skill to be mastered. Their buildings were constructed using local materials, traditional techniques, and knowledge that could be passed down through generations. More importantly, they understood shelter as a process, something you created, maintained, and improved continuously using readily available resources and human labor. Medieval peasant buildings weren't crude huts thrown together by people who didn't know better. They were sophisticated examples of what we now call vernacular architecture, building techniques that had been refined over centuries to work optimally with local materials, climate conditions, and available tools. The basic structure was elegantly simple, a framework of timber posts and beams that provided structural strength, filled with wattle and daub walls that provided insulation and weather protection. But the sophistication was in the details and the deep understanding of material science that made these simple buildings remarkably effective. Timber selection required understanding wood properties and how different species performed in different applications. Oak was prized for structural elements because of its strength and rot resistance. Ash was used for tool handles and moving parts because of its flexibility and shock resistance. Different woods were harvested at specific times of year when their properties were optimal. Winter-cut timber had lower moisture content and better structural characteristics. Foundation design used principles of drainage and thermal protection that modern builders often ignore. Stone foundations raised the timber structure above ground moisture while providing thermal mass that moderated temperature swings. The stones were carefully selected and fitted to create foundations that could last for centuries without maintenance. Wattle and daub wall construction combined lightweight framework with effective insulation using entirely local materials. Wattles, thin wooden strips or branches, were woven between structural posts to create a lattice framework. This framework was then covered with daub, a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and sometimes dung that dried to create an effective insulating wall. The daub mixture was precisely formulated based on local materials and climate conditions. Clay provided binding strength and weather resistance. Sand added structural stability and prevented cracking. Straw or other organic fibers provided tensile strength and insulation. Animal dung, when available, added binding properties and helped repel insects. Medieval buildings were designed around sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics that maximized comfort while minimizing fuel consumption. These weren't accidental design features. They were intentional engineering solutions that had been tested and refined over generations. The central hearth was the heart of the thermal system, but its placement and design were carefully calculated to maximize heating efficiency. The hearth was typically located in the center of the main living space, allowing heat to radiate in all directions. The fire was usually built on a raised stone platform that stored heat during burning and continued radiating warmth long after the fire died down. Smoke management used natural convection and building design to remove combustion products while retaining heat. Most peasant cottages didn't have chimneys in the modern sense. Instead, smoke was allowed to fill the upper portion of the building before escaping through gaps in the roof. This might sound primitive, but it actually provided several benefits. The warm smoke heated the entire upper portion of the building, the smoky environment preserved stored food and building materials, and the simple system had no complex components to fail or maintain. Thermal zoning within buildings created different temperature zones for different activities. The area immediately around the hearth was warmest and used for cooking and primary living activities. Secondary areas were cooler, but still benefited from radiant heat. Sleeping areas were often built on raised platforms or in lofts where warm air naturally collected. Building orientation and window placement maximized solar gain during winter, while minimizing heat gain during summer. Buildings were typically oriented to capture maximum sunlight during cold months. Small windows reduced heat loss while still providing necessary light. Some buildings incorporated passive solar features like south-facing walls made of thermal mass materials that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. When peasants were away from their permanent homes, shepherds, travelers, soldiers, or refugees, they needed to create effective shelter quickly using only materials available in the immediate environment. These emergency shelter techniques were sophisticated systems that could provide life-saving protection in harsh conditions. The debris hut was perhaps the most effective emergency shelter design ever developed. The basic structure was simple. A ridgepole supported at both ends, with smaller poles leaned against it to create a framework. But the insulation system was revolutionary. The entire structure was covered with debris, leaves, grass, pine needles, any organic material available, piled thick enough to provide serious insulation. The key insight was understanding that effective insulation requires depth and air trapping. A debris hut used feet of loose organic material to create insulation values that rivaled modern sleeping bags. The debris wasn't just thrown on randomly. It was layered and organized to maximize insulation while shedding rain and preventing settling. Site selection for emergency shelters required reading the landscape for protection from wind, drainage to prevent flooding, and availability of materials. The best sites were naturally sheltered areas, rock outcroppings, dense tree groves, or natural depressions that provided wind protection and building materials while avoiding areas prone to flooding or cold air pooling. Lean-to shelters provided simpler construction for shorter-term needs or when materials were limited. A single slanted roof structure could be built quickly and provided effective protection from rain and wind. The back wall was often built against a natural feature like a large rock or tree that provided additional protection and structural support. For permanent structures, medieval peasants developed construction techniques that created buildings lasting for centuries using only hand tools and local materials. Many of these buildings are still standing and in use today, demonstrating the effectiveness of traditional construction methods. Timber framing used sophisticated joinery techniques that created incredibly strong structures without nails or metal fasteners. Mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, and other traditional joints were cut precisely using hand tools and assembled into frameworks that could withstand centuries of use. These joints were often stronger than the wood itself and actually improved with age, as the wood seasoned and the joints tightened. The construction process was organized as community efforts that brought together multiple families to raise major structures. Barn raisings and house raisings were social events that combined necessary construction work with community building. The knowledge required for timber framing was shared through these communal construction projects, ensuring that building skills were maintained and passed down through generations. Roofing systems used local materials to create waterproof covers that could last for decades with proper maintenance. Thatch roofing, using straw, reeds, or other organic materials, provided excellent insulation and weather protection when properly installed. Thatching was a specialized skill that required understanding materials, layering techniques, and weather patterns to create roofs that shed water effectively while providing insulation. Stone construction was used for foundations, walls, and specialized buildings that required maximum durability. Dry stone construction, building without mortar, created walls that were both incredibly strong and naturally draining. The stones were carefully selected and fitted together using techniques that had been refined over generations. Medieval construction techniques can be adapted for modern use, providing building methods that are sustainable, affordable, and resilient, while often outperforming modern construction in key areas. Natural building techniques using earth, straw, and timber are experiencing a renaissance as people rediscover their advantages. Cob construction, building with clay, sand, and straw, creates buildings with excellent thermal mass and insulation properties. Straw bale construction provides superior insulation using agricultural waste products. These techniques can be learned by anyone and use materials that are available locally in most areas. Timber framing can be combined with modern insulation and finishing techniques to create buildings that have the strength and longevity of traditional construction with modern comfort and efficiency. Modern tools make traditional joinery faster and more precise, while maintaining the fundamental strength advantages of timber frame construction. Passive solar design principles, learned from medieval building techniques, can be incorporated into modern construction to reduce energy consumption while improving comfort. Understanding building orientation, thermal mass, and natural ventilation can create buildings that maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal energy input. Emergency shelter techniques remain as effective today as they were centuries ago and can provide life-saving protection when modern shelter isn't available. Understanding how to build debris huts, lean-tos, and other emergency shelters using natural materials provides crucial survival skills for outdoor activities, emergencies, or situations where conventional shelter isn't available. Perhaps the most important lesson from medieval shelter construction is developing what we might call a shelter mindset, understanding building as an active problem-solving process rather than a passive consumption of housing products. This mindset involves seeing building materials in natural environments rather than just in lumber yards and hardware stores. Understanding how different materials perform in different applications. Developing the skills to work with hand tools and natural materials. Most importantly, understanding that effective shelter can be created using local resources and human knowledge rather than requiring complex supply chains and industrial systems. The shelter mindset also includes understanding building as an ongoing process rather than a one-time event. Medieval buildings required continuous maintenance and improvement, but this maintenance could be done by the inhabitants using local materials and traditional skills. Modern buildings often require specialized contractors and expensive materials for maintenance, creating dependencies that medieval buildings avoided. For modern people, developing this shelter mindset provides multiple benefits beyond just emergency preparedness. It creates deeper understanding of how buildings work and how to maintain them effectively. It provides skills for improving existing homes using natural materials and traditional techniques. Most importantly, it creates confidence that effective shelter can be created under any conditions using available materials and human knowledge, a capability that has sustained human civilization for thousands of years and could do so again if necessary. The unseen fortress. When we think about medieval defense, our minds immediately go to the romantic imagery of castles and knights, massive stone fortifications, armored warriors on horseback, epic battles between armies. But that was the world of the aristocracy, maybe 5% of the population. For everyone else, the vast majority of medieval people, defense was about something entirely different: ingenuity, psychology, community coordination, and making the most of available resources. Modern security thinking is dominated by individual solutions, alarm systems, cameras, safes, firearms. We've been conditioned to think about defense as something we purchase rather than something we create, something that depends on technology rather than knowledge and community cooperation. This approach creates the same vulnerabilities we see in other aspects of modern life: Dependence on systems that can fail, isolation from neighbors who could provide mutual support, and reliance on external services that may not be available when they're needed most. Medieval peasant communities faced threats that make modern crime look trivial: roving bandits, invading armies, civil wars that could destroy entire regions. They couldn't call the police or hire security companies. They had to create defense systems using local resources, human ingenuity, and community cooperation. The solutions they developed were remarkably effective and remain relevant today for anyone interested in genuine security rather than the illusion of security. One of the most brilliant aspects of medieval peasant defense was the concept of defensive landscaping, modifying the environment itself to create security barriers that were both effective and sustainable. These weren't obvious military installations that advertised their defensive purpose. They were seemingly natural features that channeled, delayed, and discouraged potential threats, while serving multiple peaceful purposes. Hedge laying represents perhaps the pinnacle of this approach. This wasn't simply planting thorny bushes and hoping they would grow into barriers. It was sophisticated bioengineering that created living fortifications more effective than most man-made barriers and far more sustainable. The process began with planting young trees, typically hawthorn, blackthorn, or other thorny species, in lines where barriers were needed. But the real art came in the management. When the trees reached sufficient size, they were partially cut through near the base, not completely severed, but cut deep enough to make them pliable. These partially cut trees were then bent over horizontally and woven between upright stakes, creating a dense, interlocked matrix of living wood. The genius of this system was that the partially cut trees remained alive, continuing to grow and strengthen the barrier over time. Each growing season added new shoots, new thorns, and increased density. After several years, a properly laid hedge became virtually impenetrable, too thick to push through, too thorny to climb over, too well rooted to tear down easily. But hedge laying served multiple purposes beyond just defense. The hedges provided windbreaks that protected crops and buildings. They created habitat for small game and beneficial birds. They established property boundaries and livestock enclosures. Some hedges incorporated fruit and nut trees that provided food while maintaining their defensive characteristics. It was the ultimate multi-purpose infrastructure: defense, food production, windbreak, and property management, all in one living system. The psychological effect was as important as the physical barrier. A well-maintained hedge sent a clear message: this community knows how to organize, plan for the long term, and work together effectively. These weren't traits that bandits or raiders wanted to encounter. Much easier to target communities that appeared disorganized or unprepared. Medieval communities understood that the landscape itself could be weaponized through careful modification and strategic use of natural features. These modifications were often subtle, appearing natural to casual observers while providing significant defensive advantages to people who understood the system. Village layout was rarely accidental. Winding paths and irregular street patterns broke up lines of sight and created confusion for outsiders, while being perfectly navigable for residents who knew the system. Dead ends and cul-de-sacs could trap unwary intruders. Key choke points could be quickly blocked or defended by small numbers of villagers. Strategic obstacles used natural and constructed features to channel movement along predictable routes where defenders had advantages. Creek crossings could be controlled by removing bridges or creating obstacles at fords. Road improvements could include subtle modifications that favored defenders: slight elevation changes, strategic placement of trees or rocks, improved footing on one side versus the other. Water management systems often served dual defensive purposes. Mill races and irrigation channels could be quickly diverted to flood key areas or deny water to besiegers. Wells and springs could be protected or poisoned if capture seemed inevitable. Some communities built elaborate underground water systems that could supply defenders while being inaccessible to attackers. Hidden caches and escape routes provided backup options when direct defense wasn't feasible. Food stores, weapons, and other critical supplies were hidden in locations known only to community members. Escape routes through marshes, forests, or other difficult terrain allowed evacuation when defense wasn't possible. Perhaps the most effective defensive system developed by medieval communities was human intelligence gathering, creating networks of observation and communication that made it nearly impossible for threats to approach undetected. Every person in the community was part of the intelligence system. Farmers working in fields provided early warning of approaching groups. Shepherds and hunters ranging widely around the community brought back information about unusual activities. Traders and travelers were systematically debriefed about conditions along travel routes and in other communities. Communication systems ensured that information could be transmitted quickly across the community and to neighboring villages. Church bells weren't just for religious services. They were communication devices that could transmit coded messages about different types of threats. Smoke signals, horn calls, and other communication methods could alert entire regions to approaching dangers. The social organization of medieval communities meant that strangers were immediately obvious, and their presence was noted and evaluated. In a world where most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace, unfamiliar faces stood out immediately. Strangers weren't necessarily treated with hostility, but they were definitely watched and assessed. Community memory preserved information about past threats and defensive successes. Stories about previous attacks, effective defensive strategies, and community heroes served both as entertainment and as preservation of tactical knowledge. These stories kept defensive strategies alive in community memory and reinforced social bonds that made effective defense possible. Medieval peasants couldn't afford specialized weapons, nor were they typically allowed to own or carry military equipment. Instead, they became masters of improvised weaponry, using agricultural tools, craft implements, and household items as effective weapons when necessary. Agricultural tools were naturally suited for combat adaptation. Scythes, originally designed for cutting grain, became fearsome weapons when properly wielded. The long handle provided reach, the curved blade could cause devastating injuries, and the tool was so common that it didn't attract attention from authorities who might restrict weapon ownership. Pitchforks were even more obviously adaptable, essentially spears with multiple points that could be used for thrusting or hooking. Woodworking tools provided another category of improvised weapons. Axes used for splitting wood became deadly combat implements. Hammers and mallets could crush armor and break bones. Draw knives and other cutting tools could be adapted for combat use. These tools had the advantage of being completely legitimate to own and carry while providing serious defensive capability. Fire-hardened spears represented the simplest manufactured weapon that peasants could create. A straight wooden shaft with one end sharpened and hardened in fire created an effective thrusting weapon that could be made by anyone with basic woodworking skills. Spears had the additional advantage of providing reach, allowing defenders to engage attackers from a safer distance. Projectile weapons could be improvised from common materials. Slings were devastatingly effective in skilled hands and could be made from leather scraps or woven fibers. Rocks, clay balls, and metal objects became dangerous projectiles. Simple bows could be made from appropriate wood, with arrows fashioned from straight shoots. These weapons were quiet, reusable, and could be made entirely from local materials. Medieval communities understood that the most effective defense was often preventing attacks from happening in the first place. They developed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques designed to deter potential threats and create reputations that made their communities unattractive targets. Displays of organization and competence sent clear messages to potential threats. Well-maintained defenses, obvious prosperity, and signs of community coordination indicated that attacking this particular community would be more trouble than it was worth. Bandits and raiders preferred easy targets, disorganized communities with poor defenses and weak leadership. Strategic misinformation could misdirect threats away from vulnerable communities. Spreading stories about the community's fighting capabilities, defensive preparations, or powerful allies could discourage attacks. Creating false impressions about the community's wealth, either exaggerating poverty to make the community unattractive or exaggerating defensive capabilities to make attacks seem risky, could redirect threats elsewhere. Alliance building with neighboring communities created mutual defense networks that multiplied defensive capabilities. Formal or informal agreements for mutual aid meant that attacking one community could bring retaliation from multiple villages. Communication networks between allied communities could coordinate responses to threats and share intelligence about potential dangers. Reputation management focused on creating community identities that discouraged attacks while encouraging trade and peaceful relations. Communities that developed reputations for fair dealing, effective defense, and strong internal organization were more likely to be left alone by potential threats, while attracting beneficial relationships with traders and other communities. Medieval defensive principles can be adapted for modern community security challenges while respecting legal constraints and contemporary social conditions. Neighborhood organization based on medieval community defense principles can create modern security networks that are far more effective than individual security measures. Neighbor knowledge systems, communication networks, and mutual aid agreements can provide security benefits while strengthening community bonds. Environmental security design can incorporate defensive landscaping principles into modern neighborhood design. Strategic landscaping, lighting, and infrastructure placement can create security advantages while maintaining attractive, livable communities. Understanding how landscape features affect security can guide decisions about property improvements and community planning. Intelligence gathering and communication systems can be adapted for modern use through neighborhood watch programs, community communication networks, and systematic information sharing about security concerns. Modern technology can enhance these systems while maintaining the community-based approach that made medieval systems effective. Legal self-defense strategies can incorporate principles of improvised weaponry and community defense, while respecting modern legal constraints. Understanding how everyday tools can be used for defense, developing community response plans for emergencies, and training in legal self-defense methods can provide security without violating contemporary laws. The most important lesson from medieval peasant defense is understanding security as a community responsibility rather than an individual problem. No single family, no matter how well armed or prepared, could defend against serious threats. But communities that worked together, planned collectively, and supported each other created security systems that could deter or defeat much larger and better equipped adversaries. This community-based approach to security offers several advantages over individual defensive strategies. It multiplies available resources and capabilities. It provides redundancy when individual defensive measures fail. It creates social bonds that strengthen communities in multiple ways beyond just security. Most importantly, it recognizes that genuine security comes from being part of a strong, well-organized community rather than from isolating yourself from potential threats. Modern applications of this principle might include neighborhood security cooperatives, community emergency response teams, mutual aid networks, and local self-reliance initiatives. The goal isn't to recreate medieval life, but to understand the principles that made medieval communities resilient and adapt those principles for contemporary conditions. The medieval peasants' greatest defensive asset wasn't in their improvised weapons or their hedgerows, it was in their community connections. Their security came from being part of a network of people who knew each other, looked out for each other, and could work together effectively when threats arose. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Your greatest security asset isn't in your gun safe or your alarm system, it's sitting on your neighbor's front porch. Medieval medicine and health management. Modern medicine is a miracle of scientific achievement that has extended lifespans, eliminated diseases, and created healing capabilities that would seem like magic to our ancestors. But it's also a complex centralized system that can be disrupted by supply chain failures, infrastructure collapse, or simple unavailability of medical services. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, hospitals were evacuated and pharmacies were underwater. When COVID disrupted global supply chains, critical medications became scarce. In rural areas or during emergencies, modern medical care might simply be unavailable when it's needed most. Medieval peasant communities faced this reality every day. There were no hospitals, no pharmacies, no emergency medical services. If someone got sick or injured, they had to heal with whatever was available locally and whatever knowledge the community possessed. This forced them to develop sophisticated medical systems based on herbal medicine, preventive care, community health management, and practical treatment techniques that worked reliably with locally available resources. What's remarkable is how effective these systems were. Medieval life expectancy statistics are often misleading because they include high infant mortality, but people who survived to adulthood often lived well into their 60s or 70s, not dramatically different from modern lifespans when you account for lifestyle factors. They did this using medical knowledge that was both surprisingly sophisticated and completely sustainable. Medieval communities maintained what amounted to living pharmacies, carefully managed gardens and wild areas that provided medicinal plants for treating virtually every health condition they encountered. This wasn't folk medicine based on superstition. It was sophisticated botanical medicine that has been validated by modern pharmacology. The monastery gardens of medieval Europe were essentially research hospitals where monks developed, tested, and refined herbal treatments over centuries. These gardens contained hundreds of medicinal plants, each carefully cultivated and managed for specific therapeutic applications. The knowledge wasn't kept secret. It was shared through manuscripts, teaching, and practical application that spread effective treatments throughout medieval society. Willow bark was known to reduce pain and fever. It contains salicin, which is chemically related to aspirin. Medieval healers didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the effects and developed standardized preparation methods. The bark was harvested at specific times of year when salicin content was highest, dried properly to preserve potency, and prepared as teas or tinctures with consistent dosing guidelines. Digitalis from foxglove was used for heart conditions, centuries before modern medicine understood its cardiac effects. Medieval healers knew that foxglove could help people with certain types of heart problems, but they also knew it was dangerous in incorrect doses. They developed careful harvesting protocols, leaves collected at specific times of day when alkaloid concentrations were optimal, and precise preparation methods that maximized therapeutic benefits while minimizing toxicity risks. Echinacea was used for infections and immune support, particularly during plague years, when conventional treatments were ineffective. Medieval healers understood that echinacea worked best when taken at the first signs of illness, and that different parts of the plant had different potencies. Modern research has validated these traditional uses, confirming that echinacea contains compounds that stimulate immune function. But medieval herbal medicine went far beyond individual plants. Healers understood drug interactions, contraindications, and complex preparations that combined multiple plants for enhanced effects. They knew that pregnant women shouldn't use certain herbs, that some combinations could be dangerous, and that individual responses to herbal medicines varied significantly. Medieval communities understood something that modern medicine is rediscovering: prevention is far more effective and less expensive than treatment. They developed comprehensive lifestyle approaches to health that prevented many diseases and maintained overall wellness using sustainable, community-based methods. Diet as medicine was a fundamental principle of medieval health management. Different foods were understood to have different therapeutic properties, and meals were planned to maintain health rather than just satisfy hunger. Bitter herbs stimulated digestion and prevented stomach problems. Garlic and onions provided antimicrobial benefits that helped prevent infections. Fermented foods supplied beneficial bacteria that supported immune function. Seasonal eating aligned food consumption with natural cycles and nutritional needs. Spring foods, young greens and shoots, provided vitamins and minerals needed after winter's limited diet. Summer foods emphasized fresh fruits and vegetables that supplied energy for intensive labor. Fall foods included nuts and preserved items that built energy reserves for winter. Winter foods focused on stored grains, preserved meats, and fermented vegetables that provided steady nutrition during the lean months. Physical activity was built into daily life through work patterns that maintained fitness and strength without requiring dedicated exercise programs. Agricultural work provided cardiovascular conditioning, strength training, and flexibility maintenance. Walking was the primary transportation method, ensuring that everyone maintained basic cardiovascular fitness. Manual labor developed functional strength that supported overall health and injury prevention. Sleep hygiene followed natural light cycles that supported healthy circadian rhythms. Medieval people typically went to bed shortly after sunset and woke with sunrise, aligning their sleep patterns with natural hormone cycles. This natural timing supported better sleep quality and overall health compared to the artificial lighting and irregular schedules that disrupt modern sleep patterns. Medieval communities developed sophisticated emergency medical techniques that could save lives and prevent infections using only locally available materials. These techniques were often more effective than modern first aid because they were designed to work without external medical support. Wound cleaning used multiple techniques to prevent infection in an era before antibiotics. Honey was applied to wounds for its antimicrobial properties. Modern research has confirmed that honey creates an environment where harmful bacteria cannot survive while promoting healing. Wine or vinegar was used to clean wounds, providing antiseptic effects through alcohol and acetic acid. Certain plant preparations provided additional antimicrobial benefits. Bleeding control techniques used materials and methods that are still effective today. Direct pressure with clean cloths controlled most bleeding. Yarrow and other plants were applied to wounds for their astringent properties that helped stop bleeding. Cauterization with hot metal was used for severe bleeding when other methods failed. These techniques could control bleeding effectively enough to save lives in emergency situations. Bone setting was practiced by village healers who understood enough anatomy to treat simple fractures and dislocations. Splinting techniques used available materials, wood, leather, cloth, to immobilize injured bones while they healed. These methods weren't perfect, but they prevented many disabilities and saved limbs that might otherwise have been lost to infection or improper healing. Pain management used combinations of herbal medicines, physical techniques, and psychological approaches that provided significant relief without modern pharmaceuticals. Willow bark, poppy extracts, and other plant medicines provided pain relief. Heat, cold, and massage provided additional comfort. Distraction techniques and community support helped patients cope with pain during healing. Medieval communities understood that health was a collective responsibility that required community-wide coordination and mutual support. They developed public health systems that prevented disease transmission and ensured that everyone had access to basic medical care. Quarantine procedures were used to prevent disease transmission during epidemic outbreaks. Communities that suspected plague or other infectious diseases would isolate affected individuals and families to prevent spread. These quarantine methods were surprisingly effective and helped many communities survive plague outbreaks that devastated other areas. Sanitation systems prevented the spread of disease through proper waste management and water protection. Human waste was managed through latrines positioned away from water sources. Animal waste was composted properly to kill pathogens while creating fertilizer. Food preparation areas were kept clean to prevent foodborne illnesses. Midwifery and childbirth support ensured that women had skilled assistance during labor and delivery. Midwives were trained in techniques for managing difficult births, preventing infections, and caring for newborns. They also provided prenatal and postnatal care that reduced maternal and infant mortality rates. Elder care systems ensured that aging community members received support and medical attention. Older people were valued for their knowledge and experience while being cared for by younger community members. This intergenerational support system provided both practical care and emotional support that contributed to overall community health. Medieval communities understood that mental and spiritual health were integral parts of overall wellness and developed comprehensive approaches to psychological care that complemented their physical medicine. Community support systems provided psychological resilience through strong social connections and mutual aid networks. People facing difficulties could rely on family, neighbors, and community institutions for support. This social safety net prevented many mental health problems while providing resources for recovery when problems occurred. Spiritual practices provided meaning, comfort, and coping mechanisms that supported mental health during difficult times. Religious observances, community rituals, and spiritual counseling helped people process grief, trauma, and life challenges. These practices weren't just religious, they were practical psychological tools that helped maintain mental wellness. Herbal treatments for mental health used plants that modern research has shown to have genuine psychological effects. St. John's wort was used for depression. It contains compounds that have antidepressant properties. Valerian was used for anxiety and sleep problems. It has mild sedative effects that are still recognized today. Lavender was used for relaxation and stress relief. Its aromatic compounds have genuine calming effects. Work therapy recognized that meaningful activity was essential for mental health. People experiencing depression or anxiety were encouraged to engage in productive work that contributed to community welfare. This approach provided purpose, social connection, and achievement that supported psychological recovery. Medieval medical knowledge can be integrated with modern healthcare to create more comprehensive and resilient health management systems that work when conventional medical care isn't available. Herbal medicine can complement modern pharmaceuticals while providing backup options when conventional medications aren't available. Learning to identify, harvest, and prepare medicinal plants provides health insurance that doesn't depend on supply chains or prescription systems. Understanding which plants are safe and effective for common health problems creates options for self-care during emergencies or when medical services aren't accessible. Preventive lifestyle approaches based on medieval health principles can improve modern health outcomes while reducing dependence on medical interventions. Seasonal eating, natural sleep patterns, regular physical activity, and stress management techniques can prevent many health problems while improving quality of life. First aid skills adapted from medieval emergency medicine can provide life-saving capabilities when professional medical help isn't available. Understanding wound care, bleeding control, and basic treatment techniques using available materials can make the difference between recovery and disaster during emergencies. Community health networks based on medieval models can provide mutual support and shared resources that improve health outcomes for everyone involved. Neighborhood health cooperatives, skill-sharing networks, and mutual aid systems can provide health support that doesn't depend on institutional medical systems. The most important lesson from medieval medicine is understanding health as personal and community responsibility rather than something that can be outsourced to medical professionals. Medieval people understood that maintaining health required daily attention, lifestyle choices that supported wellness, and community systems that promoted collective health. This self-reliant approach to health doesn't reject modern medicine. It complements it by providing backup systems and prevention strategies that work when conventional care isn't available. Understanding basic herbal medicine, first aid, preventive lifestyle practices, and community health principles creates health security that doesn't depend on external systems. The medieval approach also emphasizes the connection between physical, mental, and spiritual health, recognizing that wellness requires attention to all aspects of human experience. This holistic approach often produces better health outcomes than systems that treat symptoms without addressing underlying causes or lifestyle factors. For modern people, developing this health mindset means taking responsibility for learning basic medical skills, understanding how lifestyle choices affect health, building community connections that support wellness, and creating backup systems that work when conventional medical care isn't available. It means understanding that the most important health insurance isn't a policy, it's knowledge, community connections, and the skills to maintain wellness under any conditions.